Hello, I'm Anna Gelpern. I'm a law professor at Georgetown and a fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I am here to talk about government debt. The strange thing that happened was that in about March of 2020, in the space of just a few days, $80 billion whooshed out of emerging markets and low-income countries. And everybody predicted a giant government debt crisis, dozens and dozens of government defaults. And even though the pandemic turned out to be far more devastating and many more people died than were expected, there actually were way fewer defaults than most people predicted. Now, there has been an enormous amount of stress, and countries were already over-indebted going into this crisis, and so they came out dangerously over-indebted, some very, very dangerously over-indebted. And yet, only 6 countries defaulted. Now, that's still a record number of defaults, but 6 is a lot less than several dozen. And by the end of 2020, early 2021, even low-income countries, so-called frontier markets, were floating bonds in the international capital markets and had them oversubscribed. What have we learned? What happened that made these predictions go wrong? I'd say our lessons fall into 4 categories. First, countries that desperately need funding to meet urgent public health needs are not necessarily the same countries that are most vulnerable to debt distress, right? Middle-income countries, emerging markets have enormous stocks of debt, and many of them are in truly precarious positions. And in fact, about half of the defaults were middle-income countries. On the other hand, the relief programs that were organized in the course of 2020, the debt suspension initiative that the Group of 20 organized and the successor initiative, the Common Framework, they were really targeting the poorest of the poor. Now, some countries got a substantial amount of relief that way, at least debt postponement, but many countries just needed new money. And debt is not always, and frankly shouldn't be presumptively, a way of financing basic human needs and urgent public health needs. We really need to rethink our institutional architecture for financing these needs quite apart from the debt problem, right? And then we need to be prepared to deal with the debt problem as such. The second big lesson we learned is something that also has been brewing for a long time, and that is the sovereign debt ecosystem, the kind of institutional universe in which governments borrow these days is far more diverse than it was even 10, 15 years ago. So the creditors are much more diverse. They include other governments that hadn't been big lenders before. Of course, China is on everyone's mind these days, but it's not just China. It's other new creditors. The Gulf states, India, Russia are big creditors. And the instruments that countries use to borrow are quite different. Many of these new lenders come from very differently organized economies compared to the old G7, right? So we have a lot of institutions that are lending that are not quite public and not quite private, and they don't really fit in the existing kind of debt architecture that originated in the late 20th century. The kinds of contracts countries use and the way in which they borrow is also very different, which makes it really hard to tell whether a particular obligation is even debt at all. It makes it very hard to interpret debt data. And that, I think, is a very important source of risk. Diversity doesn't fit neatly into the institutional architecture that we live in. And therefore, when something goes wrong, or when there are new risks on the horizon, or when there's a shock like the COVID shock, right? All kinds of things turn up. Hidden debts, debts that may or may not count as debts, debts that may be easier or harder to restructure, collateralized debts. And some of it, to be sure, is a governance issue. But I think that that's too simplistic. It's not all about governance and corruption. I think there are a lot of new players on the scene, and I think the terms of this new arrangement, this sort of new constellation of actors and the terms on which they deal with one another are not really settled quite yet. And that is, again, something that really came to the fore in the context of the COVID shock. So this really leads me to this third lesson, which is that the COVID shock both sharpened our understanding of this new ecosystem and the diverse actors and instruments and dynamics at play here, but it also exposed enormous information and coordination problems, right? So we don't even have basic agreement on, as I just mentioned, what counts as debt, let alone what counts as sustainable debt in a world where everybody uses different accounting standards. What's net present value? Well, it kind of depends on what your discount rate is. And if everybody's using a different discount rate, it's kind of not obvious what the net present value of relief might be. What is comparable relief? What constitutes equal treatment among such diverse creditors? This all has to be coordinated. This has to be negotiated. And it has to be coordinated and negotiated in a period of immense stress, where everyone's bandwidth is, overtaxed, to put it mildly, and trust is not at its highest, shall we say. That said, I do think that this crisis has also revealed some positive things and some productive institutional possibilities in this world. So the fact that all of a sudden we were talking about a much more diverse group of creditors, a much more diverse group of debtors and obligations, it really helped, I think, broaden the minds of both scholars and policymakers engaged in this world to look just at a broader set of factors and ask harder questions about not just how do you fix a particular contract clause, but how do you create institutions where countries can get relief and creditors and other stakeholders can be treated fairly when there's not enough food to go around. We've seen contracts used in unexpected ways, which broadens the frame, but we've also seen at least attempts at creating new international institutions that bring in a broader range of stakeholders. So the successor to the debt suspension initiative I mentioned at the outset, the just kicking the payment can down the road a year or two, is something called the Common Framework. And that is supposed to be an institutional platform, albeit an informal one, where new kinds of government creditors, including China and India and Saudi Arabia and even countries that are not in the G20, are at the table. It at least made it very clear, whether it can deliver or not is a separate issue, that all other creditors, including all kinds of private creditors, would need to share in this, in the burden of bringing the country back to sustainability. But the process is not transparent What we're seeing is some really promising institutional experimentation. The jury is very much out on whether these kind of hopeful institutional shoots will actually grow up and bear fruit. At a minimum, I think this crisis has refocused us on the real problems. It has, I think, confirmed what many of us believe with a passion, that this is a field that requires interdisciplinary inquiry. It requires lawyers to listen to economists about things like, sustainability, but also to ask political scientists about it. And, hopefully economists and political scientists might ask lawyers about things like contracts and bankruptcy and the broader institutional structures within which these markets exist, and hopefully diminish human misery just a little bit in these difficult times.